Welcome, devoted Shakespeareans. Simon Godwin is my name, and I am the Artistic Director of the Shakespeare Theatre Company in Washington, D.C. It's now July, which marks almost 3 months of the Shakespeare Hour. Wow. Thank you for joining us every Wednesday. Many of you have written to me to say how much you are enjoying your weekly date with the Bard. I certainly am. Before we get started, I want to thank Monica Gerard-Sharp, who has generously supported tonight's episode. I've known Monica since my days at the National Theatre in London, where she was an amazing supporter of classical work. Monica, you are terrific. The Shakespeare Hour is produced as part of our larger artistic initiative called Shakespeare Everywhere, which is generously sponsored by the visionary Beach Street Foundation. Thank you. And it wouldn't be the Shakespeare Hour if I wasn't broadcasting live from Rectortown Methodist Church here in Upperville, Virginia. As always, my thanks to the congregation for hosting me. Well, it's my pleasure now to introduce our panelists who between them have such numerous credits we couldn't possibly list them all here tonight. This evening, we are joined by Sir Jonathan Bate, esteemed Shakespearean scholar, author, and a professor at both Arizona State and Oxford universities. Jonathan, are you there?
I am indeed, Simon. It's great to be here.
Great to see you, Jonathan. Last time we met was I think, in a restaurant in London.
That's right. We were both on the cusp of big moves to the States, you to DC and me here to Arizona, where I'm having to get used to 100 degrees being a cool day.
Wow. And Jonathan, am I right that your work in Arizona actually brings together literature and the environment?
Yeah, that was the really exciting thing about the approach I had from Arizona State, which is really the most innovative university in America at the moment. I've always been interested in the role that literature, drama, film can play in helping us to think about questions of the environment, the environmental crisis, crisis of climate change. And ASU was the first university to have a school of sustainability, to make interdisciplinary study of questions of sustainability a discipline in itself. So my appointment is jointly in the Faculty of Arts and the School of Sustainability. And over the years, a lot of my work, particularly actually my work on the Romantic movement, the poets of Romanticism who were so influenced by Shakespeare, has looked at the way that they address questions of how humankind relates to nature, to the environment. And of course, Shakespeare, who has wisdom about every dimension of life, although the environment was very different in his time, he's got quite a bit to teach us about how we live with nature, and indeed how we live with some of the more uncontrollable forces of nature, such as pandemic, which was something he lived through, and as I'm sure we'll be discussing, did a lot to shape aspects of his career.
Wow, Jonathan, thank you. What a wonderful start. And thank you so much for joining us. It's really terrific to see you in America. We're also joined by Anthony Heald, accomplished film and stage actor who spent 12 seasons as a member of the acting company at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and who during this time played Shakespeare himself in Bill Kane's play Equivocation. Hello, Tony.
Hello, hello, how are you?
I'm very well. Where are you this evening?
We have lived in Ashland for the last 25 years, and so I'm in Ashland, where the now idle Oregon Shakespeare Festival is headquartered.
Oh, okay. And this is idle because sadly, like so many theatres, the festival has had to sort of go on pause for the time being.
Yeah. The town is a ghost town.
Wow. Yeah. Wow.
Thankfully, in terms of not having a lot of traffic. So
yes, but you're really missing the spirit of Shakespeare right now.
Very much, yeah, very much.
Well, needless to say, I'm glad we can try and conjure him together this evening.
Me too.
Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
And finally, Dr. Lena Orlin, a professor of English at Georgetown University, author, and the former director of both the Folger Institute and the Shakespeare Association of America. Lena, are you there?
I am. Can you see me? I'm glad to see you.
Glad to see you. I can see you very well with your wonderful bookshelves behind you. Where are you this evening, Lena?
I'm closer to you than either of the other two are. I'm in Bethesda, Maryland.
Ah, very good. So I've actually, I think, yet to make my first visit to Bethesda because I only, of course, arrived in DC in the late fall. But I hear it's a wonderful part of the city.
Well, let me know when you get here and be glad to show you around.
Love that. We'll have a Shakespeare coffee. Welcome, Lena. Thank you for being on the show with us tonight. And as always, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and co-host, Drew Lichtenberg, STC's resident dramaturg and literary manager. Drew, good evening.
Good evening, Simon, and good evening, everyone watching at home. I'm really excited, as well as Simon is, I'm sure, to discuss tonight's topic with this wonderful panel. But before we do that, I just want to remind everyone watching at home, and if this is your first time, there are two special features on Zoom that allow you to interact with us. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and a chat button. So if you want to ask any of our panelists a question, please use the Q&A button. We've already gotten a question that I will be asking shortly. And if you want to share comments with everyone else in the webinar, please use the chat button. Which brings me to tonight's theme. Tonight is the first time we are not discussing one of Shakespeare's plays. It's week 11, so we thought we'd get a little bit radical and loosen up or change a little bit of the structure. We are discussing instead Shakespeare's life. Now, this is a very big topic, a very charged topic. Shakespeare is one of the most speculated about men of all time, human beings of all time. And I think as a result, we know a great deal about Shakespeare's life. In fact, I would argue we know more about Shakespeare's life than many of his contemporaries. So it's hard to get a hold all at once of Shakespeare's life, and the temptation is to use the life as a kind of decoder or a skeleton key for the plays, which I think we all might agree can be a pitfall of Shakespearean scholarship. So I thought we would, before we get to the life, which we're going to move through chronologically, we thought it would be a great idea to ask each of our guests the specific lens that they are using to discuss Shakespeare for tonight's conversation. So Jonathan, can we start with you? What scholastic angle will you be taking tonight?
Yeah, well, I'm going to talk about Shakespeare in London. That, of course, is where he made his career, where he joined his company of actors, became a central figure in the company, moved through various theatres, built the Theatre of the Globe, and where he went to the court. So really every aspect of his professional career is London-based. Although, as we'll discover, there were also times when he left London.
And I think I have a good idea, given your answer, of what frame or lens Lena will use. In fact, it's the one you were telling me, Lena, of your forthcoming book on Shakespeare's life. What is the angle that you are going to be taking tonight?
Right, so I'm finishing up a book called The Private Life of William Shakespeare. And I have to tell people straight away that I'm not talking about his sex life, which I am sure is a disappointment. What I mean by private life is really his family life, and specifically his life in Stratford. And so that's where I've started out, is working in archives in Stratford. The first biography of Shakespeare was written in 1709 by an editor named Nicholas Rowe. And Rowe thought that it was justifiable to write a biography because he said sometimes you can understand the works better if you know the life. What has tended to happen with biography since then is that, as you were suggesting, people have worked in the other direction, trying to read the plays into the life in order to fill out some of the details that we feel we don't have about what his life was like. I've kind of taken a vow that I'm not going to mention a play or a poem in my biography. We'll see whether or not I'm able to stick to that, but I'm mostly working with historical documents about the town of Stratford, people he knew, and what his life was like back in his hometown.
Aha, wow. That's quite the literary challenge that you have set yourself, to not discuss any of Shakespeare's poems or plays. Although I should also add that if you have any question that you've ever wanted to ask about any aspect of Shakespeare's life, please feel free to do so. These are sort of the parameters of our conversation: Stratford and London, the two poles of Shakespeare, if you will, but we are not going to limit our conversation to that. And also, many of you have asked, and you will receive more of the Shakespeare Hour. We are going to, I think, go an extra 10 minutes tonight as a wild experiment into the time beyond 8:30. So we will be ending at 8:40. And Tony, I do not mean to omit you. What specific lens do you take in discussing Shakespeare's life tonight?
Well, I'm an actor, and I spent most of my career doing new plays in New York. And finally, about 25 years ago, I decided it was time to really concentrate on Shakespeare and classical theater, and had vacationed in Ashland, came here, and decided this was the place to move to if I really wanted to do good classical theater. So since I've been here, I've done 12 seasons, and I've done a number of Shakespeare roles, but I also played Shakespeare in Bill Kane's wonderful play, Equivocation. So I'm coming from the lens of an actor who has performed Shakespeare and performed as Shakespeare.
Wonderful. And Lena and Jonathan have also identified some sonnets for us, which we will ask you to read periodically over the course of the
Fine.
So thank you in advance for that, Tony.
Yeah.
So why don't we start chronologically with Shakespeare's early life in Stratford, and specifically one of the questions that people often ask. In fact, I've already been asked that question tonight: is Shakespeare's education. Given Shakespeare's lack of a formal education, what accounts for his extensive knowledge of literature and of faraway places he probably never visited? Asks James. So Jonathan, you've written this amazing book on the classics and Shakespeare that came out just last year. So I'm going to plug it if you're not going to. I wonder, you're speaking about London, but I think this speaks directly to his life that he did lead in London as a playwright, about his education and the nature thereof.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is perhaps the one aspect of Shakespeare in Stratford that I can talk to as well as Lena. His father was on the town council in Stratford, and that meant that he was entitled to a free education at the grammar school. Now, grammar schools were a really important new thing in Shakespeare's time in the 16th century. The Tudor age, the age of Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth, was a time when there was a great growth in education for middle-class boys. And that was partly because England was really beginning to become a nation with a bureaucracy, with a local legal system, with administrators, court officials. And so there was a need to have literate, educated boys. On the whole, women didn't have such great educational opportunities. But something that education always brings is social mobility. So Shakespeare went to the grammar school in Stratford-upon-Avon. And because all the grammar schools in England had more or less the same syllabus, although the syllabus of what he actually studied in Stratford doesn't survive, we can work it out from the syllabuses of other grammar schools. And indeed, we can work it out from references in the plays, because Shakespeare's knowledge of the classics, particularly the literature and history of ancient Rome, closely corresponds to what he would have learned in school. In fact, one of the few scenes in Shakespeare where you almost feel he's writing about himself is a lovely little scene in his play, The Merry Wives of Windsor, where there is a clever, cheeky schoolboy called William, who is given a Latin lesson by a rather pompous Welsh schoolmaster. And as it happens, one of the schoolmasters in Stratford in Shakespeare's time was a man called Jenkins, which is a very Welsh name. So we know from the plays and from our kind of general knowledge about grammar school education at the time, exactly how Shakespeare would have learnt in school, the sort of techniques of language learning linguistic skills, the skills of rhetoric and argumentation. And we know too the poetry, the history books that he would have read. And it was an amazingly good education that they got, even if he left the grammar school before sort of graduating, he would still have covered an amazing amount of ground. Latin was the absolute basis of the education. It's called a grammar school because they learned Latin grammar.
You mentioned, Jonathan, his father serving on the Stratford Council. And I think, Lena, you were telling me there's a whole chapter in your book about Shakespeare's father, who was also a glovemaker, was he not?
He was, and that was his primary professional identification, was that he was a glove maker and a processor of skins. I think that Shakespeare was very much a product of the kind of social mobility that Jonathan was just talking about, in the sense that his father was terrifically aspirational. As far as we know, he grew up in a little village area on a farm, essentially, named Snitterfield outside Stratford. When he moved to Stratford, it was as if he were the first person in his family to go to college. It was his chance to enter a way of making money as opposed to just producing farm products. And he was terrifically ambitious. It's what made it possible for Shakespeare, as Jonathan said, to go to school and to get an education. He was, however, at the same time, I think, also a victim of his father's aspiration, in the sense that his father kind of got ahead of himself, and having been on very much an upward career in the town, having in fact risen to the position of bailiff, which is the same thing as being mayor in the town, he then suffered a kind of financial collapse, probably when Shakespeare was about 13 or 14. And to my mind, that was tremendously liberating for Shakespeare. In other words, had that not happened, I'm sure he would have been fated to follow his father's path, if not into glove making specifically, into some other trade or craft. But with his father's failure, having hit just when he turned 13, 14, something like that, I think he was freed up to think about different ways of pursuing his life. And I think that's what brought him to London, and what made it possible for him to be something other than a provincial craftsman.
So your argument is that Shakespeare would have been a mere glove maker had his father not been so ambitious and indeed bankrupted himself.
And got ahead of himself. Yeah, there are a few apocryphal records from the late 17th century that indicate that he was training as a butcher. So I don't know that he would have gone into his father's business specifically. Butchery and glove making actually were linked, because that's where the skins came from. So I tend to think that these apocryphal stories maybe were true, that he was being trained as a butcher. It was also, as it turns out, a kind of upwardly mobile profession for people who are in that line of business, doing that kind of trade, because you could transfer, instead of just being a slaughterman. You could trade in animals in a way that made it possible for you to be a merchant rather than just dealing in butchery. So I think that his father probably set him up for a business that could have been remunerative if he'd had the backing and the financial base, which would have meant that he would have prospered in that field.
So you heard it here, folks. Shakespeare would have been a cutter of meats had it not been for his father's business failure. He does move to London. We don't know exactly when, sometime in the late 1580s, presumably. But he also gets married in Stratford. And Lena, it's very interesting. The deed of marriage, it is written at a time when Shakespeare is 18 years old and Anne Hathaway is, I think, 26 years old. So there's been a great deal of speculation over the nature of the marriage between Shakespeare and Anne.
Yeah, I don't think that there's any way of knowing exactly what their relationship was like. I think that's a privacy that's impenetrable. But from everything I can see, it was a good partnership, a good working partnership. And she was running the household in Stratford while he was in London. There's also a way in which the marriage was another liberation for him, in the sense that had he been bound as an apprentice, he would have been tied down in Stratford until he was 24, 26, 27, something like that. But the rules of apprenticeship at the time were that an apprentice could not be married. So with his early marriage, if he had been apprenticed as a butcher, he would have been able to break his contract, which again is another thing that would have made it possible for him to do something other than what his father may have had in mind for him.
We have a number of questions here. I want to get to Tony reading sonnets. Simon, I want to include you, but it's crazy. It's
I'm loving it. I'm amazed already.
But two people have asked about sort of Stephen Greenblatt's argument in Hamlet and Purgatory about the nature of Shakespeare's religious identification, whether he was a Catholic or a Protestant. This is also, like his relationship with Anne Hathaway, an unanswerable question. We don't have decisive evidence one way or the other in the plays, but I'm wondering Jonathan, Lena, do you have beliefs, theories, ideas?
Yeah, I mean, there's, of course, what you've got to remember, in Shakespeare's parents' generation, everybody was a Catholic. That was the background. And it is the case that the movement away from Catholicism towards Protestantism went much more slowly in the countryside than in the city. And it's also the case that there were a lot of well-known recusants, Catholics, some of whom indeed were involved in the gunpowder plot in the area around Stratford. Having said that, the main document that has led people towards the idea of Shakespeare the Catholic, which was a so-called Catholic confession of faith found in the rafters of his birthplace house in the 18th century, in which allegedly his father John professes the Catholic faith, that has decisively been shown to be a forgery. And so I'm more skeptical about this idea of the Catholic Shakespeare than many people are. And of course, one of the reasons that we will never really get the answer is because matters of religion were very controversial at the time. There was censorship of plays, so Shakespeare had to be very, very careful about how his plays appeared from the point of view of religious faith.
And two more questions, one from Suzanne on Shakespeare's view of women. Do you think his view of women was typical for his time, or were there aspects that were more quote unquote contemporary, and what in his life might account for that? And a question from Simon, not our Simon, but your Simon, about the sonnets. I understand that he did not publish his sonnets as he was writing them. If so, why not? Was he working on them, perfecting them until they were finished? Obviously, the plays and their own deadlines had to be staged, and of course the plays would be amended over time. Is there a fundamental difference between the sonnets and the plays? And I think, Tony, before we answer those questions, it might be interesting to hear sonnet number 93, which I believe was Lena's recommendation as one that sheds some light on these two questions.
Sonnet 93, you want me to read it?
Yes, sonnet 93.
So shall I live, supposing thou art true, like a deceived husband. So love's face may still seem love to me, though altered new. Thy looks with me, thy heart in other place. For there can live no hatred in thine eye, therefore in that I cannot know thy change. In many's looks the false heart's history is writ in moods and frowns and wrinkles strange. But heaven in thy creation did decree that in thy face sweet love should ever dwell. Whate'er thy thoughts or thy heart's workings be, thy looks should nothing thence but sweetness tell. How like Eve's apple doth thy beauty grow, if thy sweet virtue answer not thy show.
Wow. So, Lena, why did you suggest that we read that sonnet tonight? Do you think it sheds light on maybe Shakespeare's attitude towards women, or his relationship indeed with his wife, Anne Hathaway?
I actually don't think it sheds any light on his attitude towards women. It's one of the young men's sonnets, that it's written to a man rather than to a woman. The reason that I asked for it is this. As I said, the first biography of Shakespeare was written by Nicholas Rowe in 1709. The person who was down to write the second biography towards the end of that century was a man named William Olds. He never succeeded in actually finishing the biography, but he compiled a lot of materials. He was in the habit of jotting down notes, and then he had little bags strung from his ceiling, and he would drop them, that was his sorting system for the notes he was making about Shakespeare's life. He also annotated some books, and all his stuff after he died, when his biography was incomplete, was passed to other editors of Shakespeare. And critically, what some of those editors got, Stevens and Malone, were his notes on Sonnet 93. Old said, without any evidence at all, that the phrase, like a deceived husband, which we just heard in the second line of that sonnet, must have been written because Shakespeare had heard some rumor of his wife's inconstancy. Now, again, we understand that like means that this is a metaphor rather than an actual report, and it's a sonnet that's written to a young man, a fair youth, rather than to a woman. But the great Shakespeare editor, Edmund Malone, picked that up and ran with it. He knew that the sonnet was written to a man, but he also thought, well, you know, there's an awful lot of jealousy in Shakespeare's plays. He misquoted Olds. Rather than saying that Shakespeare had heard some rumor of his wife's inconstancy, he said that Shakespeare must have been feeling a suspicion of her infidelity. So he was transferring Olds' kind of completely speculative remark into Shakespeare's psychology. And from there, I always think of that as the kind of stone, and then, you know, it just kept accumulating moss or sending out ripples across other centuries, because as people found out more information, discovered more documents about Shakespeare's life, they were consistently interpreted from within the framework that Olds had established when he said that this has to do with Shakespeare feeling betrayed by his wife.
And you've actually just answered another question from the same Simon as before, who was asking about the speculation that the twins might not have been Shakespeare's, Hamnet and Judith. It's this, as you point out, it is this editorial tradition of conjecture based on a kind of misreading of Sonnet 93, which I think is...
Yeah, that's where it all started. But then, you know, people discovered that Anne was already pregnant when they got married. They decided, therefore, that it must have been an enforced marriage. In fact, somewhere between 35 and 40% of women were pregnant at marriage. That's kind of how people knew that it was time to get married. But, you know, each little piece, the next thing was the will, the second best bet. There have been kind of incremental things that people have always read as reflecting upon an unhappy relationship. And by the middle of the 19th century, people were saying that the one thing we know absolutely is the unhappiness of that marriage. And it's, you know, it all goes back to the misreading of the sonnet.
Wow, it's extraordinary how these kind of things appear, and getting to the roots of them is so helpful. How cultures bias themselves towards certain narratives. I'm interested in just asking Tony, if I may, about, was Shakespeare's wife in your show? Tony, what kind of relationship did you have with your wife when you played it?
In equivocation, Shakespeare's Shag's primary relationship to anybody in his family is with his daughter Judith, who in the play is living with him in London and serving as a kind of housekeeper, someone to take care of him. Judith does not, Anne does not really figure prominently in the play.
Yeah, equivocation is definitely a London play instead of a Stratford play. It's Shakespeare as a living, working playwright, from my memory of it. I realized, Jonathan, we have not answered the question about the sonnets.
Yeah, it's a good question. The evidence is that the sonnets were written at various different times in Shakespeare's career. There's just one of them, number 145, not a very good one actually, which has a pun on hate away, hath away, and there's a pretty good chance that's a very early poem that might have been written for Anne Hathaway. But we know for sure that he began writing sonnets in the early 1590s, at the time when the theatres were closed because of plague. So he comes to London sometime in the late 1580s. There's a very interesting legal document that suggests he was doing some family legal business about a problem with a mortgage in London in 1588. Then in 1592, we get the first reference to him as someone who's an actor who's become a playwright. His career begins then, but then there's an outbreak of plague, and for nearly 2 years, the theatres are closed. When that happens, with the London theatres closed because of stopping the spread of the pandemic, the actors go on tour into the country, but Shakespeare doesn't go with them. What he does instead is try to begin to make a career as a poet, as opposed to a playwright. He publishes a wonderful narrative poem called Venus and Adonis, a very funny poem based on a rather saucy story by Ovid, who was the favorite poet that he read in school. And he also starts writing sonnets. And we know this because one or two of the sonnets that are later published in his collected sonnets appear in his play Love's Labour's Lost, one of the first plays he writes when the theatres reopen after the plague. So the suggestion that most scholars would share would be that he starts writing sonnets in the early 1590s, when pretty well every poet wrote sonnets. It was just something you had to have in your repertoire. I've always been particularly interested by the preface to one of the collections of sonnets by a minor poet called Giles Fletcher, where he says, reader, you might be wondering, are these sonnets autobiographical? Who is the object of love in these poems? Are they really meant for a lover, or are they meant to flatter a patron, or am I just making them up? And he says, I'm not going to tell you. It might be one, it might be another, it might be a bit of each. And I think that's the case with Shakespeare as well. A lot of people would suggest that the beautiful young man he's writing to was perhaps the Earl of Southampton, who was the patron to whom he dedicated that early poem, Venus and Adonis. But then there is also evidence that some of the sonnets are written later in his career, when his patron was the Earl of Pembroke. I've got a hunch that maybe some of them are for Southampton and some are for Pembroke, but that they weren't, as your viewer said, they weren't published immediately at the time. They weren't published in the 1590s, when so many sonnet collections were. It wasn't until 1609, towards the end of his career, that they were published. And even then, there's a lot of uncertainty as to whether he authorized that publication, or whether they fell into the hands of a publisher and he didn't actually want them published. So a lot of uncertainty about it. And of course, part of that uncertainty is due to the fact that the great majority of the sonnets are addressed to this beautiful young man whom he seems to be in love with one way or another. We don't know whether that's a sexual love or a kind of idealization, but that was very unusual. Nearly all the sonnet cycles of the time are addressed to a beautiful woman. To address them to a beautiful youth, there's only Shakespeare and one other poet who do that. Wow, this is extraordinary, and I'm just wanting to catch one little hinge between as I'm following the chronology. Maybe Lena and Tony and John, we can all just spend a second on this, which is that I'm gripped by the notion, new to me, of Shakespeare, grammar boy, the apprentice, the butcher, and then that moment comes when he decides not to do that, to go to London, to become a man of the theatre. And I'm just so curious about where we think that impulse came from, because I imagine it wasn't a conventional journey from apprentice butcher to actor. I mean, even today, it's slightly like, oh, they're going to be an actor. But I'm sure it was, or was it a much bigger deal in its time? I don't know whether Tony and then Lena want to come in with that.
You know, I've always been found the story of Shakespeare working as a tutor in his late teens in Lancashire, and being in an area where there was a lot of recusants, and also an area where there was theater happening in the home. There was a group of actors who were part of the household, and Shakespeare might have participated and might have made contact with some of the London actors that he would later join company with. I think that there had to be some kind of exposure to live theater that stimulated him to explore that as a possible profession. However that happened, you know, there would have been people coming through, theater troupes coming through Stratford, and I think he got the bug.
Thank you, Lena.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think actually that one of the formative moments for Shakespeare may have been when his father was elected mayor or bailiff, because he became very important. He had to wear a fur-trimmed gown. The beadle in the town came, knocked on the door, and escorted him to the council hall where he was going to be presiding over meetings of the local council. And there was a lot of pageantry associated with being a bailiff. And so for a 4.5-year-old boy, I think that must have been really kind of something that would have been tremendously impressed itself upon his imagination. And that may have been his first introduction to the kind of staging of event and of ceremony, even before, as Tony said, traveling players came through, and then he would have been introduced to plays and so on. The story that's usually told about there used to, in the 18th, 19th century, there were kind of two stories about why Shakespeare left Stratford. One was a fable that he had illegally poached some deer from a neighboring squire. And so he basically, for health and safety, had to leave Stratford. The other is that he had been trapped in this marriage with his wife, and he couldn't abide living with her and wanted to leave. What I find interesting about both those stories is that they make Shakespeare a victim of some ill-considered behavior. Either he was trapped by her pregnancy, or he was trapped by having marketed stolen deer or whatever. And I think that there was a lot more design to his life than he's been given credit for. And I don't see why we should be surprised that the intelligence and the creativity that we meet in his work didn't also apply to the way he decided he wanted to live his life.
There's another old story about how he started as an actor, which is that it was the case that touring companies of actors visited Stratford. And on one occasion, the company visited, and one of the actors had just been killed in a fight. And so people said, well, maybe, sort of Shakespeare said, oh, I'll take his place. I'm not very persuaded by that, but I think one of the really interesting aspects of him going to London, which, as I say, initially seems to have been to do legal business on behalf of his family. He went to see a man called John Harborne, who was the family lawyer, who was based at a place called Clement's Inn, which actually Shakespeare famously mentions in a great scene in Henry IV. And there are lots of connections that Shakespeare then makes with the legal world. And that was a route. There were other dramatists who also moved from the legal world into the theatre world, because if you think about it, a theatre is a little bit like a law court, isn't it? You get people standing up and making speeches, putting one side of the argument, then the other side of the argument. The audience is a bit like the jury. And so a big part of the training of lawyers in London was putting on plays. And we know some of the earliest recorded performances of Shakespeare were at the so-called Inns of Court, specifically for the lawyers. Comedy of Errors, Twelfth Night, we know there were early performances there. So I think that connection with the legal world is one of the things that takes him towards the theatre.
Just fascinating. This is such a rich conversation. We already are past the 30-minute mark. So we are at our sort of soft interval for the night. And this is usually the time in the show when Simon updates us on future guests, gives us an update on the Phoenix Fund. So Simon and Gordon, indeed, do you have a graphic and an update for who is going to be joining us in future weeks?
Well, that's right. Gordon working behind the scenes brilliantly. I can show you the list of what's coming up next. Here it is, I think. And I can tell you about a few new guests. On July the 15th, we have two brilliant minds from the Oregon, indeed brilliant, linked to Tony, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, to discuss Shakespeare and America, including their new artistic director, Nataki Garrett, and Amrita Ramanan, the literary director there. And for Shakespeare and opera, the following week, we're thrilled to be joined by the tenor, Russell Thomas, who played Othello at the Washington National Opera this fall. We hope you'll register to join us for this exciting month of conversations. And yes, the Phoenix Fund, the STC Lifeline, which is directly supporting our staff and indeed making this show, is currently down to your donations and many others. We have reached over $1.2 million. Every dollar is still being matched by our extraordinary visionary board member, and translating for your love for Shakespeare into a donation means keeping the classical torch alive in the nation's capital and keeps this show running. So thank you. Back to you, Drew.
So we've been talking about Shakespeare moving to London, getting established as a young man in the theater. I wonder if we can leap forward a little bit in the chronology to the 1590s, the 1600s, indeed even the early 1610s, when Shakespeare is established as a playwright in London, working with the Lord Chamberlain's men and then the King's men. He's also at the same time becoming a very wealthy man and a buyer, a speculator in real estate back in Stratford, and sort of knitting these two worlds together. And we have a few questions about this topic or this phase of Shakespeare's life. One from Mickey. In the recent delightful BBC comedy series Upstart Crow, which I will admit not to having seen, although I promise to check it out, Shakespeare is humorously depicted as being quite insecure. due to having neither the status of a gentleman nor a university education. So how did Shakespeare's social status and limited education affect his life and work? That seems like a good way of beginning this conversation about the next phase of Shakespeare's life. Lena or Jonathan, who wants to go first?
Well, I'm a massive Upstart Crow fan, so maybe I should go first on that. I think Upstart Crow is absolutely brilliant. It's incredibly funny, but it's also very, very well researched, and very true to exactly our theme tonight of this double life of Shakespeare moving between London and Stratford. There is no doubt that Shakespeare was insecure. Early in his career, the first reference to him in the theatre, he is described as an upstart crow. Somebody of lower class, a jack of all trades, who has presumptuously moved over from acting and patching up other people's plays to writing plays of his own without a university degree. All the other top dramatists at the time, Christopher Marlowe, George Peele, Tom Nash, Robert Greene, they had all gone to Oxford or Cambridge. And if you went to Oxford or Cambridge and got a degree, you could call yourself a gentleman. Shakespeare wasn't a gentleman. And Lena talked earlier about his father sort of running into financial problems. And I think Shakespeare really wants to re-establish the respectability of the family name. So one of the things we find him doing is applying for a coat of arms on behalf of his family so that he can call himself William Shakespeare Gent. That sense of genteel status was tremendously important to him. And we know from various references in other plays of the time that this question of him trying to get a coat of arms, trying to get genteel status, was something that he was mocked for.
Yeah, isn't it Ben Jonson mocking him for not without mustard?
That's right, yeah.
And Jonathan, you've actually identified a sonnet, which I wonder if, Tony, we can read. I would like to hear Sonnet 111, which I think may speak to Shakespeare's sense of shame at being a playwright rather than a poet or a gentleman.
Sonnet 111.
Yes.
Oh, for my sake, do you with fortune chide, the guilty goddess of my harmful deeds, that did not better for my life provide than public means, which public manners breeds. Thence comes it that my name receives a brand, and almost thence my nature is subdued to what it works in, like the dyer's hand. Pity me then, and wish I were renewed, whilst like a willing patient I will drink potions of easel gainst my strong infection. No bitterness that I will bitter think, nor double penance to correct correction. Pity me then, dear friend, and I assure ye, even that, your pity, is enough to cure me.
And of course, this is the source of the title of Auden's classic study of Shakespeare literature, The Dyer's Hand. So what do you think he's writing about there in that sonnet?
You asking me?
Sure, Tony. Tony and then Jonathan.
Well, I'd like to hear what Jonathan has to say. It's his suggestion for a poem to read.
Okay, so Jonathan, then Tony. I mean, my view is he's clearly writing there about the fact that the theatre is a disreputable profession. He's talking about shame. He's talking about the fact that the theatre is public. He's talking about this brand on his name, that he's been branded as an actor. There are one or two little other references around the time to Shakespeare and his great friend and fellow actor, Richard Burbage. And people are saying, well, yes, on the one hand, you know, they are the master writer and the master actor, but you know, the theatre, not very reputable. We certainly couldn't give Burbage or Shakespeare a knighthood. It's only, you know, way later in the Victorian time that great actor Sir Henry Irving becomes the first actor to be knighted for his services. And there's also, I think, this sense of a little bit of ambiguity around Shakespeare's role in relation to the court. In the sonnet after that one, 112, he talks about some scandal that he's associated with. And we don't know exactly what he's saying there, but it is quite striking that in the latter part of his career, he seems to stop acting, rather detach himself from direct involvement with the theatre. His company go on acting for King James at court, but he stops acting at court. Is there some kind of scandal going on there?
And of course, we don't know the details of whether he was living full-time in London or back in Stratford. Was he shuttling back and forth? It was quite a long journey, I believe, at the time. And Lena, you write about Shakespeare's accumulation of property back in Stratford and how this becomes, maybe he's trying to become a gentleman through acquisition, through speculation, through the acquisition of real estate.
Yeah, it's a real success story that he managed to acquire as much property as he did. I would like to say one thing about the application for arms, because as Jonathan was pointing out, what happened was that the family, Shakespeare and his father, went in together on this. And I think it's interesting that they needed each other in order to be able to acquire the arms. His father was entitled to arms, having been bailiff, actually, in Stratford. That's one of the regulations allows for that. But he couldn't have been a gentleman unless he had some kind of wealth to back it up. So I think that he brought his kind of local credibility, his civic authority, and Shakespeare brought his liquidity. That is, that he had managed to make some money as an actor and as a housekeeper, a partner in the theater companies in London. The application was challenged, and the challenge mentions specifically that Shakespeare was a player. So that bears upon the kind, the fact that that kind of reputation for actors and for playwrights. His first big property purchase happened as early as 1597, and that may have been the case. I think it may have been prompted by the fact that the family's house was endangered. The original home of the family was endangered in a fire that swept through Stratford in 1594, a second fire in 1595. They may have needed to relocate. But it's been called the second biggest house in town, New Place. New Place came with a garden. They added an orchard. It was a quite large establishment. So already in 1597, he was really putting his mark on the town. And unlike other playwrights, he wasn't trying to establish himself in London. He was going back and buying his property in Stratford, which is where he continued to think of himself as being based, I think.
We have a few questions that want to zero back onto the question of women, Shakespeare and women, his relationship with women. One question from Bill Brathwaite: is there evidence of his extramarital relationships? Question from Valerie: could we return to the question of Shakespeare's view of women? I don't think we got very far beyond Anne Hathaway. And as you pointed out, Jonathan, he might have had relationships with men. We simply don't know. There's an interesting question as well for you, Tony. I'm not able to find it right now, but is it even worth knowing who Shakespeare was, whether he was Shakespeare or somebody else? As an actor, do you need anything more than the plays because the life is so enshrined or encapsulated in the work?
Well, for me, used as I am to working with living playwrights in the rehearsal, I always like to feel when I'm working on a Shakespeare play that Shakespeare is in the room. And I always am aware of the fact that what playwrights bring to their plays has so much to do with the life that they're living. So it's interesting to me to have an idea of what's happening to Shakespeare at the time that he's writing the specific play that I'm working on. At times I like to say to Shakespeare in the rehearsal hall, Will, nobody's going to understand this. Can we change this word? And things like that. But in other cases, like when I did Shylock, knowing that Shakespeare's mother's family, the Ardens, came under very severe penalties for being Catholic. And he was surrounded by people who were being persecuted for their religion. And so I see a real sympathy, empathy for Shylock and his position as a religious minority in Venice. So I think it's important to know about Shakespeare as a person while you're doing his plays.
And that was Ju Young who asked that question. I just want to give a shout out to Ju Young out there. Thank you for that question. Jonathan, Shakespeare.
Can I say something about Shakespeare and women? It's an important question. I mean, obviously going back to the sonnets, we know that some of them are addressed to a so-called dark lady, and it's pretty obvious that he's having an extramarital affair there. There's also an old theatre story for which there are two good sources, in which a citizen's wife comes to see a Shakespeare production, comes to see his friend Burbage as Richard III, and goes backstage and arranges an assignation with Burbage, but Shakespeare gets there first and is at his game when Burbage arrives, and Shakespeare says, William the Conqueror came before Richard III. So I think, you know, there's no doubt that while Anne and the family were back in Stratford, he had a little extracurricular activity in London. But I think thinking about how women are represented in the plays, the extraordinary thing really is, if you think especially of the comedies, the women are always so much smarter than the men. They are the clever ones, the witty ones. You know, think of Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing, Rosalind in As You Like It. And if you compare that with his contemporary, Christopher Marlowe, who we do know definitely was homosexual, Marlowe has very little interest in women in his plays. And I don't think really there's any other dramatist before Shakespeare who gets inside his female characters so powerfully, despite the fact, of course, he's writing them for boy apprentices, because the way that the Guild of Actors worked, women did not perform on stage.
Lena, you can speak to this, but it strikes me that his relationship with Anne was foundational. I mean, she was 6-8 years older than him and was an independent woman with independent means and a great deal of freedom, and he was attracted to that, and that was an influence in how he, as an adolescent, a young teenager, was perceiving women and their possibilities.
I think that's right. I think the question of Shakespeare's view of women is difficult for me because how many views of women did he have? I mean, I think that one of the wonderful things about Shakespeare is that his women are as rich and varied as his men are. And wasn't that unusual, in fact? I do think it's true that in marrying Anne, if it's true that she was older than he, that he was marrying somebody who was ready to go. She didn't have to go through an apprenticeship. She already knew her craft, which was running the household. She was a malt maker and so on, so that she was capable of bringing in income to the family herself. And he just seemed to have been ready to skip the kind of setting up stage that most people went through in that time. They weren't regarded as being mature until they finished their apprenticeships at the age of 24, until they got married at 26, 27, somewhere around there. And he kind of got a jump on all of that. And I think that Anne helped him do that.
And of course, with Anne, there is the question, the infamous question of the will, in which Shakespeare famously leaves Anne Hathaway nothing but his second best bed, which many people have pointed to as evidence that him and Anne had a somewhat cold or not great relationship. But that is, when you look closer at it, much more ambiguous, is it not, Lena?
Yeah, so the way in which I actually started working on this project in Shakespeare was that I happened to have been reading a lot of wills from the period, and I was struck by how many second best beds there are. It's a very common locution. And in fact, not just second best beds. I read one will that had third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh best beds. People tended to like to use the word best, whether it was applicable or not. They also, by the way, gave away worst beds and had absolutely no shame in saying worst. It's clearly in all these wills, from the context of reading other wills, that it doesn't mean anything that's in any way derogatory or slighting. It's a way of identifying a bed. And anybody walking into a household would have known, well, this is the best bed and that's the second best, because everybody had a sense of which bed was worth more, which was, you know, and just strictly in terms of monetary value. So I don't think that the idea that he was slighting her with that is sustainable. At the same time, it's also the case that the second best bed was not all that he gave her. She was entitled to dowry by law, which meant that she would have had the income from a third of his properties for the course of her life. She didn't inherit the properties. She couldn't give them away. Once she died, they reverted, the ownership of the properties reverted to his principal heir, who was Susanna. But as long as she was alive, she had the income and profits from 1/3 of his lands, and he had quite significant lands. So she was pretty well taken care of, actually, in her widowhood.
But Lena, the question I think we're all asking is, who got the best bed?
All the rest of his good, you know, there are wills that are fabulous to read because people practically list every item they own. Shakespeare didn't write that kind of will. He gave away the bed. He gave a silver gilt bowl to Judith. He gave his sword to Thomas Combe. He gave his wearing apparel to his sister. Those are the only things he mentions specifically in the will. He just wasn't somebody who named a lot of things. He said, all the rest of my stuff, goods and chattels, go to Susanna, his oldest daughter, and to Susanna's husband, because he was making the two of them executors of the will. So Susanna got the best bed. But it's just lumped in with everything else he owned.
Okay, thank you, Lena. Sure.
A question from Barbara that has been asked a couple times that I want to get to. How was Shakespeare so familiar with places and music and things that he never heard or saw? Which I think speaks to this conversation about location, Stratford versus London. How was he able to project himself imaginatively into faraway locations? Jonathan?
Yeah, a lot of this is to do with his reading. We talked about how he began in school. He was, I think, a very intelligent, rapid reader. So he just had to open a book and a whole world would come before him. I mean, the amazing thing about Shakespeare is that he seems to have known so much about so many things. As a countryman, there's all sorts of references to apple orchards and falconry and country things. But then in the city, because he lived in the heart of the city, there's a real awareness of city life. And then, of course, the acting company played at court. And so he learned about the ways of the court through performance. He also listened a lot to his colleagues. Some of his fellow actors, for example, went and played on tour in the continent, for example, at a place called Elsinore, where they discovered there were a couple of courtiers called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and that would have given him a little idea for one of his rather well-known plays. Equally, there were close links between the theatre and the fencing schools. Actors had to learn, as they do today, how to fight on stage. So he would have learnt a lot from the Italian fencing master up the road. One of his neighbours was Thomas Morley, the greatest composer of the age. So he would have been able to pop next door and get Morley to write a song lyric for him. There were people who travelled to Italy when he got to know the Earl of Southampton, his first patron. The Earl of Southampton's language tutor was an Italian immigrant called John Florio, who wrote the first English-Italian dictionary. Shakespeare would have learnt from him about Italy and indeed would have learnt some fragments of the Italian language. Shakespeare didn't always get it right. He writes two plays set in Venice and never mentions a canal. He says that it's possible to go by sea out of Milan. So he's a little bit hazy in his geography, but in terms of what he hears and what he reads, he has this extraordinary breadth of knowledge.
And in terms of Shakespeare's relationship with the court, because there's also, isn't there Emilia Bassano, who was the daughter of an Italian musician living in James's court? And equivocation focuses on this a great deal. Sort of Shakespeare as a member of the King's Men, meeting with Cecil, getting his plays approved. It would be interesting to hear from you, Tony, on playing that aspect of Shakespeare's life, but also it would be interesting to get a sense of how much intercourse did he have with Elizabeth and James or with courtiers?
You know, they were servants, so there was no direct contact. There was no familiarity other than observing. And as a playwright and as an actor, you're always observing like crazy and putting things away in your memory to use later on. I think he felt that he had an opportunity to affect what happened with the king by his plays. I'm drawn especially to the whole idea of Measure for Measure being an effort by the king's company to influence the debate that was going on between the theater community and the Puritans over whether the theater should be allowed. And I think you can look at Measure for Measure, which Shakespeare's company performed in 1604 at court, the first time James was in London for the Christmas season. And the play that the King's Company chose to do was this play about how do you reform society, through the draconian measures of the Puritan or through the humanist measures of the Duke. And he uses the whole idea of theater. The fifth act of Measure for Measure is almost a 5-act play. It can be seen, I think, as a strong brief in favor of the theater as a way of reforming and improving society. So I think he felt he had some influence.
I'm inspired by that, Tony. That's a new thought for me, Jonathan. I wonder whether you would agree with that Shakespeare is actually actively working for change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think Tony makes a brilliant point about Measure for Measure being written for King James. This is one of the reasons why it is impossible that Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, wrote the works of Shakespeare, because he was dead by the time James came to London. But Shakespeare's later plays, when his company had become the King's Men, they've been given cloth to wear at King James's coronation procession, and he starts writing plays exactly on the themes that James is interested in. James was fascinated by witchcraft, so Shakespeare writes Macbeth. James was fascinated by the attempt to unite the kingdoms of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland into a single entity called Britain. Shakespeare writes a play called King Lear, which is about dividing the realm. James was very keen on making sure he made good dynastic marriages for his daughter, his daughter and his son. So Shakespeare, in his late plays, The Tempest and the Winter's Tale, writes about royal dynastic marriages. I think he's really sort of plugged in to the preoccupations of the court in that latter part of his career, even though it may well be that a lot of the time he was back in Stratford in the big house, just sending the plays down to London, but he had his finger on the pulse of the age.
And also, this gets back to our previous conversation about Shakespeare's views on women. It doesn't seem accidental that during Elizabeth's reign, you have all of these witty, learned, erudite, courtful women who are smarter than all of the men, when of course that was the ruler of the kingdom, was this incredibly learned woman who was smarter than all of her courtiers. It sort of feels like all of those characters can never find a male equal to them, which is a kind of political statement. Getting back to Lena and the life in Stratford, there's a theory from Reed who says, wouldn't it also be likely that the best bed would have been larger than the second best bed, and thus more appropriate for his married daughter than his widow? Which I've never heard that one before, but that I kind of buy that. And another question from Catherine: what was Anne's relationship with her daughter Judith? And what about the twins, Shakespeare's relationship with them as well as Anne's? Although I should specify, Judith was one of the twins, the sister of Hamnet, who died, and the older daughter is Susanna. But what do we know, if anything, about Anne's relationship with her daughters?
Well, we don't know a lot about the daughters. I think that I was really interested in when we were talking before about equivocation, the idea that Judith was that it was imagined that Judith was the one who was living with him in London, because she's always been thought of as the kind of bad sheep in the family, and Shakespeare's favorite was Susanna. And I don't think that that's true. And I think that his will takes very good care of Judith as well as of Susanna. So I don't know that we can say anything about what either of them, what their relationship was with their children. But I would also like to go back to the question about the bed in terms of the idea that it was bigger, which is very interesting, and it is original idea to me. There's some evidence that one of the ways in which the Shakespeares made money was that they would take in important guests who were coming through town. There was a preacher who was entertained, for example, and it was when he was coming to do a visiting sermon just across the road at the Guild Chapel. And that means that they would have had a best bedroom for visitors. That's probably where the best bed was. So what I'm interested in the idea of the second best bed is if that's not the bed they're sleeping in, because they're saving the best bed for visitors, is the second best bed the bed where Anne gave birth to Susanna, gave birth to Judith, gave birth to Hamlet, and does it in that way, in fact, have sentimental associations for both of them?
There's a shout out for Tony's work from Raphael. Tony, your exquisitely nuanced shag had a streak of unrequited grief over the loss of his only son, Hamnet. Can the panel speculate as to how such a devastating loss impacted his work in London and his life in Stratford? And we are at a 3-minute warning, even with our extended running time. So Simon, you have your hand raised.
I'm going to add one thing to our great panelists tonight, which is I was wondering whether people could, yes, it's such a good question about the bereavement that we know Shakespeare underwent and what that might have done to him and his work and his life. And I want to add a corollary just as we're kind of to move into or summing up from our three guests this evening, which is that I wonder whether each person would just speak about why, and I feel it, we're so gripped by the question of who's there, to use that first line of Hamlet. What is it that's drawing us back to grapple with this individual? And like Jacob with the angel, we're locked in a kind of embrace, struggle with trying to get to the secret. So that would be my grief, and what is it that's drawing us ever closer to him? Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the death of Hamlet was enormously important because, you know, that only a boy keeps the family name alive in that generation. My absolute favorite Shakespeare play is The Winter's Tale. Very near the end of his career, he's been effectively away much of the time from home for 16 years. It's a play in which after 16 years, a man gets a chance to have a second chance with his wife. He, in a sense, closes out his wife, turns her to stone by accusing her wrongfully of adultery. But he's given a second chance. She comes back to life. But the person that doesn't come back to life is his son, Mamilius. And I think at some level, that is Shakespeare taking stock of Hamlet's death at the end of his career. And I think that it's that kind of detail that makes us so fascinated by this question of the relationship between the life and the work. I didn't like Kenneth Branagh's film about Shakespeare's last days, but it was right to focus on the loss of Hamlet. What I do love is the final episode of Upstart Crow, which is precisely about Hamlet's death.
Beautifully put, and yeah, Winter's Tale, I now see that play in a whole new light. Tony.
Your question is basically, why are we so fascinated by Shakespeare? And, you know, there's never been a better writer. There's never been anybody who's created as much brilliant poetry and fascinating characters and thrilling stories. And yet we know nothing or very little concrete about who he was. And I think that mystery is a wonderful thing to wrestle with. We can fill in the gaps as we choose. And that's why I'm so offended by the idea that anybody else wrote the plays. I think he is a endlessly fascinating person, and to find out as much as possible about who he was and what he wrote is a kind of a lifetime journey.
Lena, any last thoughts?
I think that an awful lot of Shakespeare's appeal has to do with the things we've talked about already, his enormous capacity to take in a sympathetic way, information from every direction, from observation, from reading. You know, there's just a wealth of association and meaning to everything he does. I was really interested in the recent protests in Lafayette Square here in Washington, D.C., which is where I'm located. One of the protesters said, "If you cut me, do I not bleed?" And she said, "And I want you to know I'm bleeding." And that to me was such an emotional moment, because it shows us the way in which Shakespeare still scripts our lives. And it's a combination not only of quoting from Shakespeare, but also then moving on and taking Shakespeare in another direction. When she said, "I want you to know I'm bleeding," that was her taking Shakespeare forward. And I think that has a lot to do with why we're still so fascinated by who it was who was capable of giving us language like that.
Wow. Well, I think the last 10 minutes have become very profound tonight. Simon, what do we have next week for something entirely different? I think it's Shakespeare and clowns.
I think so, which just pays tribute to the infinite variety that we're privileged to receive from this extraordinary human being. And I'd like to thank our three extraordinary human beings this evening for giving up their time, their wisdom, their experience, their knowledge, their craft, so generously, so beautifully, and so much from the heart. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Lena. Thank you, Tony. I hope you'll come back soon, and that we'll get to see you at the theatre when we reopen and we're back on the stage doing the plays. God bless.
Good night, all.